Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. We have a very important topic to discuss today that you have certainly seen in the media, and we're going to speak about the issue of settler violence. What exactly is settler violence? Who are these violent settlers, and what are they doing? Why are they causing so many problems in Israel? We're going to talk about the broader issues really that maybe underlie this concept even of settler violence, which is sovereignty in Israel. And of course, we're going to address the way the media deals with all of this. And who better to discuss this than our good friend, Danny Seaman. Danny, thank you so much for joining today.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Danny, you certainly have an expertise when it comes to understanding issues in Israel and kind of getting to the root understanding of these issues despite the way the media portrays them. So let's jump into this issue that just happened. The media, the New York Times and other international news outlets described an event that happened this past weekend about these settlers. You imagine these violent settlers carrying weapons and having, all the horrible things that kind of are brought to mind when you read these articles. Um, and then you kind of look at the reality on the ground, who these people really are, what in fact happened. And there's a great disparity between the way the media portrays what happens and what we know to be the truth. So first, if you can just share with us a little bit of the story as far as you know, and before we try to understand why it's portrayed the way it is.
What I know is basically what everybody got. On Saturday, they started publishing this report of supposedly an incident that occurred in the hillsides in Judea and Samaria, or Judea, Samaria, one of these locations there. It wasn't very clear where supposedly this thing called Na'arei Gvo'ot, the youth of the hills. Now, just so we know who we're talking about, there is a segment among religious Jews in Judea and Samaria whose children would be the modern day Zionists, if you want to call it that, because they're basically doing what the first Zionists did over 100 years ago. They are going into the hillsides and into the fields, and they're taking care of the stock and with sheep and growing things there. They're making sure that the Arabs who are violating the Oslo Agreement by expanding their communities beyond the areas that was allocated to them in the agreement itself. They're there to make sure there's a Jewish presence in these areas. And these young men put away their lives and are concentrated on doing the farming, doing the herding of the animals there. And there are a lot of people who don't like that because they're creating facts on the ground for the Jewish population there. Some of these kids don't go, and I say kids because they're teenagers, and they couldn't find a place in school. They prefer being out in the outside and performing what they believe to be an important thing for the land of Israel by doing this. Over the years, they would constantly, you have these left-wing groups who come in. There are Israelis and there are also those from abroad who come in and instigate trouble, and they actually encourage the Arabs to clash with these young Israelis. Sometimes they find them out in a field someplace. They're on their own. They're not armed most of the time, 99% of the time. And so they start throwing rocks at them. They film it all. And they create these, and then they call the police on the young Israelis. So there's this impression that grew that supposedly these kids are causing trouble out in the field. Most of the time, what they're doing is protecting themselves from instigations that the Arabs and especially left-wing activists from Europe and the United States are causing in the area there. So there was this sort of, given this impression that they're constantly causing trouble. What happened this Saturday was that a report came from the IDF spokesman reporting that an IDF unit in Judea, in Samaria, encountered these kids, and supposedly they were assaulted by these young men and by these hillside youth. And this whole thing came out with the IDF criticizing it, and immediately the media took it on themselves. First and foremost, Haaretz newspaper. most of the settlers couldn't respond to it because they're religious. They didn't even know this was being reported because they observed the Sabbath. The right-wing conservative media in Israel also observed the Sabbath. So they do this very often, using events on the Sabbath because they create an impression. And the first report is usually what people know about. Afterwards, when things are investigated and looked into, nobody knows because that's what they leave out there. Very long story short, and I addressed this on my radio show on Galei Israel Radio just on Tuesday, because there was so much misinformation coming out. And eventually, today I can say, and without going through the whole story, the police told the Attorney General's office, which asked to look into this, that there's nothing there. There was no incident. There may have been some rude behavior on the part of these youth, but it's basically because they were challenged by the IDF. They were not engaged in any altercations. They did not fire in their direction as somebody accused them of doing. There's no evidence to what the commander there said that he and his soldiers were assaulted. Were there exchange of insults? Probably, but this is not an illegal issue or requires a police investigation. So this is going to, the accusations have been dropped, and the youth who've been arrested have been released. And now we find out that it may have been an exaggeration of the circumstances which were taken advantage of by those who have a political interest in smearing not only the youth, but the settler movement in Judea and Samaria.
Danny, thank you for that
If
overview.
I may stop, somebody asked a question there. I see a question that somebody asked about the burning of an IDF station there. There's no evidence pointing that these youth did it. Just so you know, there is no evidence whatsoever. And these places are supposed to be protected by the IDF. Why wasn't it? So I wouldn't combine the two things, at least from what we know now. The fact that people in media that find it necessary to place blame before the investigation is finalized is part of this political attitude that is directed to smear a smear campaign that is being used for political purposes.
Right, I'm so glad you addressed that because you read the articles, and as you mentioned, they come out on Shabbat. And then by the time you see the article or you see the response in Israeli media, the response gets buried and people automatically assume the original reports were true. Before we go into maybe some of the underlying reasons that segments within Israel or abroad would push this issue right now, can you just give us more clarity on who these Hilltop Youth are? Are they these kids who are going out and deliberately grazing their animals in Arab communities? Are they looking for trouble? Do you know any of them? And can you kind of paint a picture of who they are? Because without appreciating who these kids are, they just seem like a bunch of kids up to no good causing problems.
It's basically what trying to leave the impression of them being such. Are there troublemakers among them? Yes. By the way, those who were arrested, not a single one of them was a settler. They're Orthodox Jews from Bet Shean, from Bet Shemesh, and from other locations in Israel who came there and to help out with the protecting of the territories there. So these were not the hillside, or whatever it's called in English, in Na'arei Agvot. It has nothing to do with them. Have there been instances where there was trouble and exchanges? Yes, nothing is ever perfect. Nobody is ever, there are problems at times, but most of these problems are usually instigated by left-wing troublemakers who deliberately are there, and they're there to film it, to create an impression of the violent settlers. By the way, there was a report issued and presented to the United Nations a few years ago that said that there was, I think, over 60% of the trouble was created by settler violence in Judea and Samaria. When they looked into this, most of the settler so-called violence was responses of Israelis to rocks being thrown at them, to terrorist attacks against them, to the organization of left-wing activities against them, and they were protecting themselves. And there are some people in the world that, especially today, have a hard time digesting the fact that Jews stand up for themselves. And therefore, they find it necessary to smear them. And look, they can all go bleep themselves because we're not these helpless and defenseless Jews. And I'm very happy and proud of those young men there because they're doing an important job for the people of Israel. And are they always perfect? No, they're not. But I don't think they go to the extent of some of the left-wingers and some of the Arabs do. They have not killed anybody there, and they have not reached a situation where they threaten the lives of anybody. If people's lives were lost, it's only in self-defense. And this was proven in an investigation of that.
Right, Danny, and I think it's important to note, and we've shared this a good number of times throughout these briefings, that there is crime in Israeli society, like there's crime
Yes.
in every country. And is there crime in Judea and Samaria? Absolutely. There's also crime in Tel Aviv. There's also crime in Jerusalem. It happens. There are people who break the law. We should not condone, we should not celebrate people who violently commit crimes. But the
Sorry for
idea.
interrupting, but on that point, I would like to add for one of these people that CNN and other media organizations find it so important to quote him and to use his opinions on things. He committed a crime. He received bribes, the former prime minister of Israel, who's so quick to smear the Israeli public. So talking about criminals, why are CNN why are they in the New York Times? Why do they find it necessary, out of all the people and experts in Israel, do they find it necessary to interview that criminal who was convicted? Sorry, I just had to say
Danny,
that.
thank you, of course, for sharing what you really think. The point I was trying to get to is there is crime in the world, but to portray the settler movement as being on the foundations of violence, and to really only paint that picture is for a certain agenda. And this leads us to the next part of our conversation. That, of course, we know that the entire region of Judea and Samaria has this big existential question about declaring sovereignty over it. Is Israel ready to try to, get the two-state solution, so to speak, to work, to pick up the pieces of Oslo, or are we finally ready to move in the direction of sovereignty? And by painting these pictures, potentially it casts doubts on sovereignty. Danny, can you kind of pick that up a little bit and maybe connect that to what's happening in broader Israel and Netanyahu's trip to DC?
There are several things happening here. First and foremost, there are tectonic shifts occurring, not only in the Middle East. In general, Israel's position is much different than it was before the 7th of October. For the last generation, the 30 to some years, we have all been focused on this land for peace nonsense. If we give them land, there'll be peace. If we recognize the PLO, there'll be peace. October 7th, erase that. It's over. Most Israelis, over 88% of Israelis polled, have said they no longer accept a two-state solution. They no longer accept the PLO responsibility, certainly not over Gaza Strip. Now we can go and have demonstrations about this, and we can rush about this. What Netanyahu is doing is very smart, like he's done throughout the years. You don't have to make statements. You don't have to, especially when you have the Europeans and the UN and international organizations, they all want this to happen because the one thing they want is a weakened Israel. We understand now that any type of weakened Israel is detrimental to our existence. So we're not going to accept that anymore. And in that sense, what we're doing in the Gaza Strip, for example, is very slowly, systematically making it impossible, not because we hate them and we don't want them and there's a genocide. There's no genocide happening there. What is happening is the fact that they use Gaza to create every centimeter of Gaza above and below ground, used for the purpose of creating a base of operations against Israel to annihilate Israelis, as they've said, to annihilate Israelis, and they made that very clear that that's their intention. So you have over 700 kilometers of tunnels underneath Gaza, and they've built operation centers under hospitals, attack centers in schools and in mosques, and every home, every building in the Gaza Strip has ammunitions for the terrorists. So every place, according to the international law, they wave in our face so diligently, according to international law, every one of these places are a legitimate target, because every country's first responsibility is the protection of their own civilians, not that of the other side. Hamas could have very well protected its own, but no, they hide behind them. And so what we're doing at the moment is getting rid of every one of these locations that served as a military installation against Israel. And that means it will be quite impossible for them to go back living in Gaza. And so this freedom of choice that is given to peoples in conflict areas all around the world shall also be given to the Arabs in the Gaza Strip, that if they choose to leave, they can leave now. And I think majority of them will. With regards to Judea and Samaria, very similar thing. The PLO is in control of certain areas there that have a majority Arab population. And as part of their control, they've lost control. Basically, Hamas and other terrorist elements are taking over in these areas and posing a threat to Israel from there as well. So making an issue right now and claiming sovereignty, and very ironically, if we claim sovereignty, most of the Arabs are going to stay there, because what could be better from them than being under Israeli control? These same idiots that are marching in the streets, ask any Arab, would they rather be under Hamas control or Israel control? The Arab, if they're honest, will say under Israel. And what happened over the years since withdrawal from areas A, many Arabs have left these areas under the PLO control and moved into areas that are under Israeli control, because they much rather be under our responsibility. If we announce that we're sovereignty, they'll all be there. Now, many of the others who didn't move left the area. You have over several hundreds of thousands. There are anywhere, the estimate, between 250,000 to 400,000 who have left Judea and Samaria, which is, from our perspective, I'm not lying about that, I'm not going to try to sugarcoat this, the best thing that can happen. But if we announce sovereignty, they're going to stay. Why would they leave? Israel is one of the best countries in the world. Why would they want to leave? So I don't think we should announce that. We should let them believe that PLO will be there. They'll leave on their own. And then maybe in the future. We don't need to create, because we already control most of the area. And today, when you no longer have the threat of Hezbollah and Syria, there are problems with Jordan, but these are things that we can handle. Very soon, PLO will lose its hold over Judea and Samaria. And I think that what is happening in the Gaza Strip will probably happen. And what's his name? Moti Kedar has said this very often in the past, that he spoke about these cantons, that the Arabs live with tribes, and the tribes control different areas. I think that Israel can very well reach agreements with these different Arab hamulot, which are tribal families, and they'll take control of these areas that are under there. And that's where it'll probably go to in the end. And that's where I think we should be trying to direct things. On the bigger picture right now, Netanyahu going to the United States, I read somewhere some Jewish article in one of the Jewish magazines or newspapers that somebody was saying, oh, Netanyahu is embarrassing himself again, running to the States. We're being the lapdog of Trump. Listen, Netanyahu has established himself as one of the greatest historic leaders of the Jewish people throughout time. He has nothing to prove anymore. His only goal before, as it is today, and I think people understand that more today, is to make sure the strength and the future of the Jewish people. He understands that in the very least right now, we have a year before we're either in elections or towards elections in Israel. Because even if the elections are in November 2026, by this time next year, we're going to be in an election campaign. So he knows we have about a year to do whatever he thinks is possible, especially with this administration, which is very supportive of Israel, to make sure that these tectonic changes that have occurred in the Middle East, that we can use to the benefit of the state of Israel. And here's what people have to understand. Israel has established itself as a superpower in this region. And now, while the other side is still licking its wounds and trying to figure out, to a large degree, what the hell has happened, because it was nothing like they were expecting. They believed in their own nonsense about themselves. And suddenly now they're running around trying to bite their own tail. We have to take advantage of this to push things in the direction of not kumbaya, my Lord, let's all hang out together around the bonfire singing songs of peace and living together. No, we know this is the Middle East. It's not going to happen. We have to make sure that the Middle East is functioning in a way that every of these countries understand it's better for them to live and work with Israel and the United States than try to annihilate Israel. It'll benefit them, will certainly benefit the Israel. And I think that's why Netanyahu and Trump are rushing, I won't say rushing things, but are moving very rapidly while everybody else is trying to figure out what happened. These two already know where they want to go. And I think they're working in that direction.
Danny, that was a lot to process. I feel like I need to watch this recording multiple times to take in everything that you've just said. But I want to go back to the issue of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. You're almost suggesting that it's better to maintain the status quo because that will degrade the Palestinian leadership at a faster rate. And I would push back and say, but it's been decades and decades and decades and decades, and it hasn't happened. There's been times when they've been stronger than they've been weaker, but they keep coming back. And if there's not this tectonic shift in terms of sovereignty, why won't they just, under a new name, a new organization, come back and cause terror as has always happened?
Yes, every 20 years it appears. If the only time it was shorter to 20 years, it's because of Oslo. It's usually you take 48, 20 years later you had 67, 20 years later you had the first Intifada. And then it wasn't 20 years because you brought in the PLO. So it happened within 12 years that you started having this violence that erupted on their side. And now we're 20 years since the second Intifada. And that's why Hamas rose to the occasion. But Israelis now are not as stupid as we were before. We understand that it's not just them trying to prove themselves or something. No, they want to annihilate us. They're very serious about this. They don't hide it. If I were Europe and the United States, I would be more concerned of what's happening in your own backyard with these same kind of people than what is happening here. Because they're taking advantage of your freedom of religion and they want to occupy the entire world. Judaism does not want to occupy anybody. It's the land of Israel. That's what we're dedicated for, and that's it. Islam wants to occupy the world and rid it of everybody else. We don't understand because we don't have that kind of thinking. Islam thinks exactly like that. And they're looking, just like they look to create a mosque on top of the area of the Twin Towers. And luckily enough, the United States did not give them permission to doing it. Now they're going to have, hopefully they don't, we'll have a Muslim mayor taking over. But all these things are the Islamic way of showing superiority. And so you should be more concerned about that than what we're doing here. Now, we understand that. We understand what we're dealing with here. So certainly Gaza will not be under the PLO control or any of these terrorist organizations, whether or not they're wearing suits. In Judea and Samaria, they already have control. His days are numbered anyway. He's in his 90s. He lives to 100. Maybe he's Moses, lives to 120. Who knows? I doubt that he's Moses. So he won't make it to the next over 20 years. At some point, there'll be tremendous division within their own society there. And I think that's where we can take a step in advance, just like we're doing in Gaza at the moment, and giving more power to these tribal leaders. And they can control their own people and find a way of working it out with Israel. If we do have this bigger picture happening here with the Saudis, they may be the last ones, but if you have this economic emphasis on improving the lives of the people here in the Middle East, I doubt that the Arabs in Judea and Samaria, and I don't use the word Palestinian because it's a fake term. It's a fake term that's used for political reasons. They will never call themselves Palestinian. They never called themselves Palestinian before 67 or even 48. They were Arabs. They were Syrians. They were wherever their family came from. So the same thing here is eventually they'll want to be part of this and they'll want to take advantage of the benefits. And that's where we should be aiming for. And that's what we should be aiming for.
Danny, I think on this issue, you are more patient than many of our viewers and many of the people pushing sovereignty, but that's okay. It's good, Danny, for sometimes you'd have a little
Well,
patience.
it's very good that they're doing that. But don't, we say in Hebrew, "Lo lishבור את הכלים." Don't break the glass because you're not getting everything that you want. I think and I remember this from my radio shows, over the past year, especially, all the criticism being directed to Netanyahu for not doing what all the geniuses who are not don't have to take responsibility for their decisions are these armchair coaches that keep telling Netanyahu what he should or should not be doing. And they were all criticizing him. And it turned out, and this is what I was saying to myself, look, I know him. If these geniuses know what he should be doing, he's probably aware of all the circumstances as well. And he's proven over the past year, time and again, that he knows, and he's doing it patiently and precisely, and he knows what he's doing. And so let's give him, a little room and trust that he's proven to us right now that more than any other leader, in at least in our recent history, Netanyahu knows what he's doing. Give him the credit for it.
Danny Seaman, always a great pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for joining this briefing and sharing all of that with all of our viewers. And thank you, of course, to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning
Just
in.
one thing, if you want a little more, I now
I
have
was
a
going to give you a
podcast.
plug, but you say it. You
Okay.
do it. Go for it.
No, I have on JNS, on the Jewish News Syndicate. I do have a podcast now called Straight Up, which I bring in Israeli guests and we talk about different issues. I had a former pilot, talking about what the Air Force did. I have the historian of the Mossad speaking about what the Mossad did in Iran. Very interesting. My last show was with the chief psychologist of Israel, talking about the resilience of the Israeli public, why that resilience exists in the past 21 months, certainly in the past month with the situation with Iran. So there are interesting things that give you insights on what's happening in Israeli society.
Absolutely. Everyone should check out Danny's podcast on JNS TV. Thank you to all our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you next week, Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.